before we even hear Rabbi Greenbaum, we have to thank him simply for the trek that he's made all the way from Rabin. So for that alone, thank you very much. I'd just like to speak for a moment how we got to such a lecture, because quite honestly, I doubt many Chabad houses or adult education centers around Melbourne are giving classes on egg donation, surrogacy, sperm donation. So this is how it all began. Chabad Malvern is a JLI chapter. We're part of the worldwide JLI adult education program, and we give 3 courses a year. One course is always going to be Kabbalah oriented. So for example, you can see on the screen, one course we gave was called the Kabbalah View. Then we'll have a course which is miscellaneous, which can be on any kind of topic related to Judaism, obviously. So this year it was Curious Tales of the Talmud, finding personal meaning in the legends of our sages. So you have a Kabbalah course, a miscellaneous course, and there's always an ethics course. The ethics can be business ethics, everyday ethics, or it can also be medical ethics. And this year's was Life in the Balance, Jewish perspective on everyday medical dilemmas. So we spoke about things like an ounce of prevention, BRCA genetic testing and preventative measures. We spoke about healthcare proxies and end-of-life care. We spoke about multi-fetal pregnancy reduction and abortion. And then in our 4th lesson, we spoke about a pound of flesh. What would Judaism say about compensation for organ donation? During that class, someone raised their hand and said, wait a second. We thought Judaism doesn't believe in organ donation altogether. So I said, if 10 people can raise their hands, we'll give a class specifically on that. And we got 10 people to raise their hands. And at that, we started Chabad Malvern Association of Medical Professionals, where we decided every couple of times a year we're going to get together and discuss medical breakthroughs and how halacha is dealing with that. So then we had organ transplants in Jewish law. That was a class we gave. During that class, someone raised their hand and said, wait a second, if we're allowed to donate kidneys, bone marrow, blood, what about sperm, egg, and surrogacy? So I said, that's out of my league. That's a bit much. And the first person I turned to Rabbi Greenbaum. Interestingly enough, my committee of medical professionals are both not here because they're both lecturing tonight on their specific fields. So we kind of missed them. But that was during this class, which brought us here tonight. Before we begin tonight, I just want to use the opportunity quickly to show a film of what our next JLI course is going to be, exactly next Wednesday, on the 14th of May. So here's a quick film. It's called Paradigm Shift. We're leading up to 20 years of the passing of the Lubavitch Rebbe. That's me, as a little boy in Karvait with my brother and my father, receiving a book from the Rebbe, which I have in my bookshelf across the road. I was pretty cute. And basically, for the very first time, we're going to be putting out there not just the Rebbe as a leader, not just the Rebbe as a visionary, but actually the Rebbe as a teacher, scholar, and philosopher. What was the original output that the Rebbe gave our generation? How did the Rebbe galvanize the Jewish community after the Holocaust, where some communities were advocating, run back to the shtetls, or totally forget about Judaism, where they said, no, we can actually increase in Judaism? What is giving young people who maybe even never met the Rebbe to get up with their families and go to places like South Korea, Cuba, Brazil, Alaska, and places like that? So I'll show a quick 1.5-minute video clip, and then we'll ask Lishi to begin.
A piece back from the camera.
1.5 minutes ago?
1.5 minutes you got?
Okay.
All of our experiences occur within a bubble, a paradigm. It's the theory we use to contain and explain everything in our lives. There is no escaping it. That is, until the bubble bursts, and we find ourselves in a whole new world of fresh perspectives, a realm of realization where new opportunities come alive, new possibilities to discover the goodness and perfection in ourselves, in others, and in every situation that comes our way. The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute presents a revolutionary new 6-week course that radically changes the way we see forever. paradigm shift. Transformational life teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Discover the visionary outlook that inspired a generation and explore a whole new dimension of living.
I visited the great rabbi of Lubavitch. He said to me that even in the darkest place, the light of a single candle can be seen far and wide.
Okay, we begin this course in exactly a week, Wednesday, this coming Wednesday here in the Chabad. I'm going to be giving that course. This course means so much to us that we're opening up the first class to anyone to attend. No fee, no obligation, just to see how you go, just to see what you think, just to see if you're ready for the paradigm shift. Without further ado, we'll ask Rabbi Greenbaum to come up. Just a second.
Thank you.
Second.
Just take it off. You can turn it off.
Turn it off?
I think everyone knows where they are.
There we go.
Thank you for the introduction. I am besides being rabbi, I'm a Rav in Shul. I'm also a head of an organization called Shifra, where we do a lot of counseling, supervision of Halachic infertility treatments. And over the course of this evening, we'll try and discuss why you need supervision, maybe. We'll discuss, and so we are the fertility providers for the Melbourne Jewish community. I started it about 8-9 years ago. It was an organisation that existed before me. It was a group of concerned local ladies who decided, who'd been in Eretz Yisrael, that seen that there's an equivalent organisation there called PUA. They decided Melbourne needs something like that. They approached Rabbi Fox, who was the rabbi in Doncaster at the time, and suggested that we set up an organisation. When Rabbi Fox relocated back to South Africa, I took over and I've been involved ever since. It's quite a journey and an experience, and a lot of studying, and I get to share that monthly roller coaster ride with some of the most bravest, most wonderful couples, ladies that I deal with. Often when I'll have that first meeting with a couple, I'll tell them, when people talk about infertility, they'll come in and say, it's her problem. She's got bad eggs, or she's old. It's his problem, he's got a bad sperm count, he's got a low sperm count, or it's unexplained infertility. And I say infertility, I would always tell them, is something that doesn't happen to a guy, it would happen to a lady, it happens to both of you. It happens to a couple. Until relatively recently that was true, however, we're being approached more and more often, and that's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Is infertility something that only happens to a couple? Specifically, we'd be approached to, it'd be surprising how often nowadays, let's say a lady, mid to late 30s, hasn't yet found her husband, hasn't yet found a partner, feels the fertility clock ticking, is worried about never having kids. She wants to know one of two things. Number one is freezing eggs, just in case. Or even nowadays we're getting the question about getting pregnant. Can she do IVF? Either through a donor, or maybe from someone from a bank, and have a child as a single mother. It's something which we have to deal with. So when I say that infertility is something that doesn't happen, that happens to a couple, is that necessarily true anymore? I can tell you the very first time I walked into an IVF lab, and it was the most extraordinary thing. We're talking about almost, it feels at the time like miles of workbenches and computer stations, and there's weird and wonderful incubators and mini incubators, minks and the like, and there's embryologists scurrying around. Everyone knows what they're doing, and you're standing there like, where should I stand? What should I do? You feel you're in their way. And I'm looking over a lady's shoulder, an embryologist, when she's doing an ICSI. ICSI is nowadays, they used to do what they call IVF, is that you take some sperm, you take some eggs, you put it together in a petri dish, and hope. Nowadays what they can do, and this is a very good technique, especially for people with low sperm count, is that even someone maybe, although a normal ejaculate might have 200 million, 300 million sperm, some guys, as close to azoospermatic, that means they have absolutely no sperm, or very few people have no sperm. So let's say people have low sperm counts. So what they can do is microscopically they can find that 1 or that 2 in the whole ejaculate. And these guys are great, these embryologists, I can tell you, they'd be amazing playing computer games. And they blow it up and they micro manipulate. We're talking about the size, and they can actually catch that one sperm and approach it closest to the egg, and then push it through. And it's the most extraordinary thing in the world. You're watching, that's the moment of conception. This is Isa Master Gracious. This is the equivalent of creation. This could, and please God does, go on to develop into an embryo, re-implanted back into the mother, child, and you get to watch that. So the embryologist is looking at this, he's manipulating, and when I'm looking over her shoulder, it's blown up on the screen many, many thousands of times. And I'm just in awe. I'm thinking, Ma Rabu Ma'asecha Hashem, how great are your actions, God? How can anyone not believe in God when you see something like this? And the embryologist turns to me and says, I've got to tell you, the natural way is more fun. Which it is. That having been said, some people don't get the easiest way in life, some people don't get the easiest path in life. And the question is, if you didn't get to do it the natural way, what are your options? Once upon a time, your options were prayer and hope. Prayer is still very important, and it still does depend on God. And it's the same miracle, whether the miracle takes place in a petri dish, or that miracle takes place the natural way, it's still a miracle. But because we now have more options, we have to, as ethicists and halachists, people who care not just what you can do, but what you should do, we have to ask ourselves, should you? Just because an option is available, should you avail yourself of it? So, for example, today's talk is going to be about specifically donor, ART, assisted reproductive technology, but I'd like to maybe just touch on for a minute or two, what are the issues with so-called regular IVF, normal IVF, the one that's been around. 1978 was when baby Louise Brown was born, so it's been around, 25 years, 35 years, I'm getting old. So, what are some of the issues why halacha would have a stake or a say with IVF in the first place? Well, issue number one is, for example, when you're actually doing the process. We know that for a lady that can be intimate with a guy, they have to go into the mikveh, they have to be non-menstruating. Certain reproductive technologies and techniques can actually cause her to spot or to stain. That might impact on her ability to go to the mikveh. What impact does that have on her future, on that future child if it's a child born of nida? Shabbos is always an issue. For some reason, we deal with all the IVF labs in town. Monash IVF always got an issue with Shabbos. Melbourne IVF, not nearly as often. Because Melbourne IVF do day 2 transfers, so we'll do an egg pickup on, let's say, Tuesday, and they'll put it back in on Thursday, whereas Monash IVF do a day 5 transfer. So we're going to have to be sending someone there, not just for pickup, not just for sperm delivery, not just for insemination, not just every time that they check and they open up their incubator. But also, we do that twice a day, or once or twice a day for 5 days, and for some reason Shabbos always gets involved, Shabbos always gets in the way, and we've got to work out that. Can you do an egg pickup on Shabbos? What happens when she's due? The eggs are ready to come. Can you Can you put it back into her body? Transfer. Shabbos and Yom Tov are always issues, and something we have to advise on.
Sorry, Mr. Stick, why are you there for this?
We're there doing supervision. It's a basic assumption, and we'll hopefully get to it a bit later. It's a basic assumption in halachic take on IVF that even if a technique is halachically acceptable, the prior, before you start anything, is there has to be supervision by a adult religious Jew. The same way is, I might personally eat in your kitchen. You can have a 100% kosher kitchen, but if you want to set yourself up as a restaurant, it needs a machshir, it needs a hechsher. Otherwise, nobody will go there, and I'm not impugning your integrity or anything like that. This is far more integral to the future of the Jewish people to know that this is his sperm, this is her eggs, that every time that the workbench was clear, that there were no mistakes. there is very rare. There have been cases of deliberate malfeasance in IVF labs around the world. I mean, you had Ricardo Ash, who was one of the pioneers of reproductive surgery, reproductive technologies in America, had to run off to Mexico because they caught him stealing embryos and using them for other ladies without their knowledge. There was a famous doctor, his name escapes me now, in '93, that he was a really successful IVF doctor. He could get the most lowest sperm count, the most infertile guys. He could get their wives pregnant until they started noticing a lot of these kids are looking the same and they're actually looking like him. There was about 75 kids in this small town who he sired. That's deliberate. And then there's been mistakes. There was a Dutch lab that a lady gave birth to twins, not identical twins obviously, because one of them was white, one of them was black. Right? Happened the same thing in New York City.
That could be natural.
It wasn't.
It wasn't.
DNA, right? It was there was some technician. Technician had left something behind on a pipette. Right? Right? In other words, she had two. There were two eggs developing that month, and it's just right. That's pretty much what we're there to developing. And then, I mean, Melbourne IVF labs are fantastic. In America, anyone wants to can get himself can set up a IVF lab in his own garage and call himself a fertility specialist. It's the Wild West. It's like that in almost every technology. But in Melbourne, there's the ITA infertility treatment in Australia. They're the best. They've got protocols. They're on top of that, and they'll tell me every so often, but you see how good our protocols are. And I say, I see how good your protocols are, but number one, this is a higher level of supervision. And number two, these are the rules. If a person wants IVF and wants to be halachic, this, nobody can ever question the child. Nobody can ever question who's the father, who's the mother. Supervision. Okay, and so we've got protocols. We work hand in hand with the institutions in America and Australia, in Israel and the like. The question is, we're trying to supervise to make sure that the sperm is the husband's and the eggs are the wives, and they're only putting back their embryos, and they're making sure that child belongs. What happens then when we're deliberately trying to use not someone a so-called donor sperm or donor embryo? So it's not the husbands, it's not the wives. It opens up a whole new question, a whole new take on so-called traditional infertility treatments. And you've got to remember, when we're talking about 35 years just for IVF, or a few years before that, but we're talking about really new technologies. And because they're really new technologies, a lot of the issues that are discussed are really still up in the air when it comes from a halachic perspective. Rabbis are debating, rabbis are fighting them, just like ethicists and doctors and scientists are debating them as well. I've got a mate who sits on the chair of ethics here in Melbourne, and they're supposed to be advising. They have an advisory committee for Melbourne IVF, and every time a new issue comes up, they're supposed to sit there, and they've got a rabbi who sits there, and they've got a geneticist, and they've got a journalist, and these things are still hot button issues. They have to be debated, and they have to be resolved.
Ask you a question, sorry. Just going back a step. Do you give a certificate to a couple that has a child?
No, but we keep records.
And the other question is, if someone doesn't go through this in the halachic way with a mashgiach,
depends on the circumstances. I mean,
can you say 100% of that child is Jewish, let's say? Are there questions?
Of course, there's questions. Can you say it's 100% not Jewish? Can you say that's the
saying
difference in
protocols
Protocols,
broad,
and in Judaism, there's always a difference in lechatchila, what you should do in the first instance, and b'di'evad, what you should do post facto. I mean, if a child is born, I mean, I'm a male as well as being a rabbi, and I deal with one of the biggest honours I get in my life is when I actually get to do the bris of a child that I was involved with the supervision. But now on my form, when someone fills it up online, one of the questions is, was this child born, was it a natural birth, was it a natural conception? And sometimes I say, no, it wasn't a natural conception, it was an IVF child, it was artificial insemination. Or they don't use the term artificial insemination anymore, they use IUI, intrauterine insemination. And
that's different though, because that's when you know who the mother is, with IUI.
I've got to tell you usually know who the mother is.
Not if
unless you're talking about surrogacy, but
even with an embryos, you're not sure.
So that's here's the word we're going to today. Who exactly is the mother? When till now you always assumed you can tell who a mother is because she's the one who gives birth. But nowadays we've divorced maternity from biology, and let's discuss that. Okay, so we've touched on some of the issues with IVF in general, and a lot of the things that we're going to be dealing with, the hinges on the question is, we all know it's a mitzvah to have kids. Pruruvu milar asaretz. You should be fruitful, you should multiply, fill the earth. That was one of the first mitzvahs that's written in the Torah. In fact, it was the first mitzvah they received after they left the ark. Have kids. And the minimum amount of kids that person should try to have is, and even after you fulfilled that mitzvah, you should continue to have kids, because the mitzvah that every child is a blessing. When God's giving out blessings, you take those presents. Is it a mitzvah to have a child by a so-called non-natural way? Is the mitzvah when you have an ejaculate from a husband into a lady through the so-called natural method? What happens if you have an assisted reproductive technique? So, for example, if the guy ejaculates into a cup and then they utilize that to inseminate his own wife, has he fulfilled the mitzvah of pruruvu? And a huge amount of discussion hinges on this, because if, for example, that is pruruvu, then, for example, a person should have children for IVF. Maybe you should have a second child. Maybe you have a 9th child, a 12th child through IVF. If it's not a mitzvah pruruvu, then why are we doing this? So some of the main halachic authorities of today debate this issue. So, for example, Mordechai Eliyahu, who just passed away, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, chief Saudi rabbi of Israel, passed away about a year ago. He was of the firm opinion that a child born through assisted reproductive techniques, assuming it comes from the husband's sperm, it's his child. And if it's his child, he should do it. And he should have, as I said, he would give heter for people having their 8th or 9th children through IVF. However, many of the main halachic authorities of today would disagree, and they'd say, no, it's actually not your child. So why would you do it at all? They say you haven't filled the mitzvah of pruruvu, so why would you allow it? But some of them would say, well, you can't. So, for example, the Tzitz Eliezer was Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the great halachic authority of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, probably the advisor to the Israeli halachic and medical community. He forbade IVF for that reason. He says if there's no mitzvah, all you're leading is to problems of sperm procurement. Masturbating is a sin according to Torah. You're leading problems of Shabbos and Yom Tov. If you're leading problems of who's the child is, don't do it. You don't have kids. He says you try your best. If you don't have kids, I'm not a Kohen. I can't do mitzvahs of a Kohen. You don't have children. You can't do the mitzvahs of having children. Rabbi Yashiv, who just passed away, the non-Hungarian, how old was he? 100 something rather. Who was the leader, I guess you call it, of the Litvischer world, of the Lithuanian Torah world. He was of the opinion that you don't fulfill your mitzvah pruruvu by having a child through IVF. However, he would allow you to have a child because of this natural, innate longing, this desire, this burning need, if you will, this innate human need to have children. And so therefore he would allow people to have a child. But the question is, once you've fulfilled that need, and the need isn't so strong, can you have a second child through IVF? Some people would say yes, based on his theory, because if you've had a boy, maybe you should try for a girl. But other people would say no, for one. So, for example, Rabbi Levin, who is the closest thing that Melbourne has to our halachic authority, he is of the opinion of Rabbi Eliashiv, who says that you don't fulfill the mitzvah of pruruvu through IVF, and therefore, when people want to have children, he will give a psak that they can have a child through IVF, and obviously if there's surplus embryos, you can try that. You can try and implant those and have extra children through that. But to start a whole new run of IVF, he doesn't advise that halachically.
Even if you have no children.
No, one child, yes, because of the Yashiv, but he doesn't allow, because it's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah pruruvu.
Why is it not a mitzvah? Like, what is the actual mitzvah?
Well, that's the question. The mitzvah is to have a natural child through a husband and a wife.
But is that what?
According to what some people say, Mordechai Eliyahu was of the opinion that the mitzvah of pruruvu is that your genetic seed should be passed on. Other people are not of that opinion. They say it's an actual act of procreation.
But surely the Torah, in explaining or stating what the mitzvah is, just says the mitzvah is to have children, as you said, to fill the earth. It doesn't say how. It doesn't specify. It must be out of your loins by a natural process.
So, for example, would you fulfill the mitzvah by adopting a child?
Absolutely.
No, you might be doing a wonderful, ethical, moral thing, but you clearly haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of having children by adopting one. You
But
might.
there
that,
are other mitzvahs that
yeah,
say
sure.
that.
No question. There's
That's a
questions you
different
said-
mitzvah to
There's
adopt.
different mitzvahs.
But
There's different
well, it
mitzvahs.
is.
Can we leave that discussion for after?
Yeah.
And because we're still trying to get through
a
a.
child is.
Okay. Now. And by the way, this incredible need people have to have kids is actually stronger nowadays than ever was before. There's an organisation in America called B'nai Olam, which literally translates as those who create the world. It was started by a guy that I've met. He's an incredible guy called Rav Bachner. He himself never had children, and this organisation, what they do is they find and they fundraise to pay for infertility treatment for people going through halachic supervision for infertility. And in Australia, the maximum you can pay out of pocket is probably $7,000-8,000, which is money, which is serious money. But after Medicare and after your health insurance, the most you're out of pocket is about $7,000 or $8,000. Whereas in America, where your private health insurance doesn't cover infertility, you can be out of pocket $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. Sort of serious funds. Huh? Sorry?
You can be here too if you do multiple cycles and that.
Yes, I'm saying at any one cycle.
Yeah.
My apologies. I should have clarified. Yes, people put their mortgage in having kids. I've dealt with some of these for years. Okay. Well, let's think.
I was say, Hanshka and I were by a dinner in New York that was honoring a fertility doctor in Philadelphia. That after the